Rewritten opening. Most people will spend $427,000 on things they never use in their lifetime. But in 1988, marine archaeologist SRRAO discovered something your ancestors may have lost 9,600 years ago: an entire underwater city. He descended into the Gulf of Khambhat expecting to find trade anchors. Instead, he found stone walls arranged in impossible patterns. Patterns that suggested something extraordinary. But what he uncovered next would challenge everything historians believed about constructed. He surfaces. He checks his notes. And the question that will consume the next decade of his life takes shape: how old are these? The answer, when it finally comes, will contradict everything the academic world thought it knew about the birth of civilization. Most people who know the name Dwarka know it from the Mahabharata, one of the great Sanskrit epics of the ancient world. In those texts, Dwarka is described as a magnificent island city, built by the divine architect Vishwakarma at Krishna's request. It had golden towers and broad avenues, harbors deep enough to receive ships from distant continents. And when Krishna died, the text says the ocean rose and swallowed it whole. Within a single day. Without warning. Scholars assigned this to the category of beautiful mythology. A moral fable about impermanence. Nobody seriously proposed looking for it. But here's what few people mention: the Mahabharata gives geographic coordinates. It names the river confluences, the coastal landmarks, the specific stretch of sea. And those coordinates point, with uncomfortable precision, directly at the Gulf of Khambhat. In the records I've kept, that detail alone stopped more than one archaeologist mid-sentence. SRRAO's 1988 expedition wasn't the first attempt to find Dwarka. The Archaeological Survey of India had conducted earlier surveys near the modern port city of Dwarka in the 1960s and 70s, finding submerged structures just offshore, fortification walls, a large stone anchor, triangular stone pieces consistent with dock mooring. Interesting. Suggestive. But not earth-shattering. Those finds were dated to roughly 1500 BCE, placing them comfortably within the Late Bronze Age, consistent with the general period scholars associate with Mahabharata-era events. RAO's deeper surveys pushed further offshore, and that's where the timeline broke open. But before we get to what those dating results actually said, there's something about the structure of what he found that the official summaries tend to gloss over. And it matters. The ruins RAO documented weren't scattered rubble. They followed a grid. There were what appeared to be streets, parallel alignments of stone running at consistent angles. There were large rectilinear enclosures that matched the described layout of residential blocks in ancient Indian urban planning. There were stone rings consistent with well construction. And threading through all of it, the remains of a massive perimeter wall, not a natural reef, not a geological shelf edge, but a deliberately coursed barrier of cut stone. This is where the official story starts to fall apart. Because grid-planned cities, perimeter walls, and engineered wells don't appear, by the accepted archaeological record, until Mesopotamia, around 3500 BCE. The Indus Valley cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, celebrated as among humanity's earliest urban centers, date to roughly 2600 BCE. What RAO was looking at predated both. By a margin that wasn't small. The carbon dating of organic material recovered from the deeper Gulf of Khambhat site, wood, remnants of worked material, return dates clustering around 7500 BCE. Some samples push toward 9000 BCE. 9,000 years before the present. That's not a footnote in the story of civilization. That's a different story entirely. Now here's where I have to stop, because something about the next chapter of this history is almost more disturbing than the ruins themselves. In 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology, a separate body from RAO's team, conducted acoustic surveys of the Gulf of Khambhat seabed while scanning for pollution levels. What their sonar returned, completely incidentally, were images of structures 5 miles long on the ocean floor. Geometric. Enormous. The survey team initially didn't know what to make of it. They pulled dredge samples from the site, Those samples contained worked artifacts, a carved human tooth, animal bone fragments, wood pieces, pottery. The wood was carbon dated by the laboratory at NGRI, Hyderabad. The date returned 9,500 years old. The announcement was made by India's then Science and Technology Minister at a press conference in 2002. It was reported briefly in international outlets. And then, the academic world largely went quiet. No major Western archaeological institution sent a follow-up team. No UNESCO investigation was mounted. The peer-reviewed response was, to use a precise word, minimal. What I found in the archive surrounding that silence is almost as interesting as the ruins themselves. Several prominent archaeologists raised methodological objections, arguing that dredged samples couldn't be reliably associated with the structures, that the acoustic images were ambiguous, that the dating needed replication under controlled excavation conditions. These are legitimate scientific concerns. But here's what the objectors didn't do: they didn't go. No formal excavation of the Gulf of Khambhat site has been completed in the 20 years since that press conference. The ruins are still down there, largely unstudied. And 3 questions remain open that no official body has answered. 3 records I'll walk you through in the next 2 minutes contradict the standard dismissal, and the third involves a deliberate omission that sat unaddressed for over a decade. First, the geological record of the Gulf of Khambhat confirms the region was dry land during the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, and remained partially habitable as sea levels rose through 700 to 600 BCE. A city submerged there wouldn't require miraculous intervention. It would require nothing more than the same gradual inundation that swallowed coastal settlements across the globe as the Ice Age ended. This is established science. It makes the existence of a settlement, even an advanced one, at that depth, at that date, geologically plausible. Second, the ancient Indian astronomical texts, the Vedas, and associated literature, contain descriptions of celestial alignments that researchers have used to backdate the composition of those texts using archaeoastronomy. The positions of stars and constellations described in certain Vedic passages, when fed into astronomical software, align with sky configurations that existed between 600 and 800 BCE. Not 1500 BCE. Not 500 BCE. The texts describe the world as it looked 9,000 years ago. Few scholars want to follow that calculation to its conclusion. Third, and this is the one that was quietly omitted from the initial 2002 report and only surfaced in a supplementary document filed 3 years later, among the dredged artifacts recovered from the Khambhat site was a small carved tablet bearing geometric markings. The markings were not analyzed in the original summary. When a researcher later requested the tablet for study, they were informed it had been reclassified and transferred to a different storage facility. Its current location is not listed in any public archaeological registry I've been able to locate. A carved artifact from a site 9,500 years old. Reclassified. Moved. And quietly absent from every subsequent report. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. Something is on the floor of the Gulf of Khambhat. It's large. It's geometric. Organic material associated with it dates to a period that precedes every city in the accepted human story. The region was habitable land during that period, geology confirms it. And the ancient texts that describe a city in exactly that location were written by internal astronomical evidence during roughly that same era. What we cannot say, what no one has been allowed to definitively establish, is exactly what those ruins are. Because the excavation hasn't happened. The Mahabharata says Dwarka was given 700 years to flourish before the sea claimed it. 700 years of a civilization that left walls precise enough to survive 9 millennia underwater. Whether you read that as mythology or as memory depends, perhaps, on how comfortable you are with the alternative. The city the ancient world mourned as lost may simply be waiting 30 meters below the surface of a gulf most people couldn't find on a map for someone with the will to go and look properly. In the archives, the record stays open. It hasn't been closed. It's been filed under inconclusive, which, in the language of institutional caution, sometimes means, we're not ready for the answer. The archivist keeps these files because someone should. If what's on that seafloor is what the dating suggests, the oldest urban civilization ever found, then the history of humanity doesn't begin where we were taught it does. It begins in the water. Off the coast of Gujarat. Beneath a city that a 4,000-year-old poem never forgot. What troubled you most about what you just heard? The geometry of those ruins, or the artifact that disappeared? Leave your answer below. I read them all.